Sometimes the earth keeps secrets not to hide them, but to wait for the right soul to listen. The first time Atlas stopped, Caleb Ward thought nothing of it. Just another pause in a long stretch of quiet days that all seemed to blur into one. The dog stood still at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, ears high, body rigid, amber eyes fixed on a patch of ground no different from the rest, as if something beneath the soil had called his name in a language only he could understand. Caleb leaned against the worn wooden fence, arms crossed, watching with the detached patience he had learned years ago, the kind of patience that came from waiting in places where time moved slower than breath. "Come on, Atlas," he called, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of habit more than command. The German shepherd didn't move. A breeze slipped through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, brushing against Caleb's face like a memory he couldn't quite place. He pushed off the fence and walked over, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, each step measured, controlled. Atlas glanced at him, just once, then looked back at the same spot, as if the world had narrowed to that single point beneath his paws. Caleb followed the dog's gaze, scanning the earth, expecting to see something obvious. A burrow, a root, a scrap of metal, but there was nothing. Just soil, just silence. "There's nothing there, boy," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Atlas let out a low sound, not quite a bark, not quite a growl, something deeper, older, like an instinct remembering itself. Caleb felt it then, a faint shift inside him, the kind that didn't come from logic, but from something buried far beneath it. He exhaled slowly and turned away. "We've got better things to do." The dog didn't follow right away. That was the first sign. Later that afternoon, Caleb noticed it again. Atlas slipped away from the porch, moving with quiet purpose back toward the clearing. No hesitation, no distraction, just a straight line, as if drawn by something invisible. Caleb watched from the doorway, a cup of black coffee warming his hands, the steam rising into the cool air. The cabin behind him creaked softly, settling into the rhythm of the day, but out there, in that patch of land, something felt different. Atlas reached the spot and began to circle it slowly, nose low, tail still, then stopped and tapped the ground twice with his paw. Not digging. Not yet. Just marking. Caleb set the cup down on the railing, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're doing it again," he said under his breath. The wind shifted, just enough to carry a faint metallic scent, so subtle it might have been imagined. Atlas lifted his head, then gave 3 short barks, spaced evenly, precise, the same pattern he had used years ago when something wasn't right, when something mattered. Caleb felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. He had heard that pattern before, in places far from here, in moments that changed everything. He walked toward the clearing again, slower this time, more aware of each step, of the way the ground felt beneath his boots, of the silence pressing in around them. Atlas didn't look at him now. He just stood there, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb had the uneasy sense that whatever lay beneath that patch of earth had been waiting too. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, stretching long shadows across the clearing as Caleb stood there, saying nothing, doing nothing, yet unable to leave. Atlas remained fixed in place, his posture calm but unwavering, like a sentinel guarding something unseen. The air felt heavier now, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for a choice to be made. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers brushing against old tension that never quite left him, no matter how quiet life became. "It is just dirt," he said softly, though the words sounded uncertain even to him. Atlas shifted his weight and tapped the ground again, once, then twice, then stopped, his ears tilting as though listening for a reply that never reached human ears. Caleb looked out across the clearing, noticing details he had ignored before, how the grass grew thinner in that exact circle, how the soil seemed slightly sunken compared to the rest, how the wind curved around it instead of passing straight through. It was subtle, almost nothing, but enough to make him pause. He took a slow step forward and crouched, pressing his palm against the ground. It felt cool, damp, ordinary, yet there was something else beneath it, something firm, something that did not belong to roots or stone. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if surprised by his own reaction, then let out a quiet breath. "You are not letting this go, are you?" Atlas did not respond, but his presence alone felt like an answer. Caleb stood and walked back toward the cabin, forcing himself to turn away, each step deliberate, controlled, as if distance alone could quiet the feeling building in his chest. Inside, the cabin greeted him with familiar stillness, the faint scent of old wood and coffee lingering in the air. He picked up his cup from the railing, now gone cold, and took a sip anyway, the bitterness grounding him for a moment. Through the window, he could still see Atlas, a steady figure against the fading light, unmoving, waiting. Minutes passed, then more. Caleb set the cup down slowly. "You are going to stand there all night, aren't you?" he murmured, though there was no irritation in his voice, only a quiet recognition. He reached for his jacket, the worn fabric sliding easily over his shoulders, and stepped back outside, the evening air cooler now, brushing against his face like a reminder he could not ignore. Each step back toward the clearing felt different this time, less like curiosity and more like acceptance. Atlas turned his head as Caleb approached, not surprised, not excited, just certain. Caleb stopped beside him and looked down once more at the same patch of earth, the same quiet circle that had somehow become impossible to overlook. He exhaled slowly, then glanced back at the cabin, at the life he had built out of silence and routine, at the safety of not asking questions. Then he looked at Atlas again. "All right," he said, his voice low but steady. "We will see what you were trying to show me." The wind eased, just for a moment, and in that brief stillness, Caleb felt something shift, not in the ground, but inside himself, like a door opening just enough to let the past and the present stand in the same place at the same time. Caleb returned with the shovel just as the last light of day began to fade into a soft blue dusk, the kind that blurred the edges of things and made the world feel quieter than it truly was. The metal handle felt cold in his hands, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried more than just weight. Atlas stepped aside without being told, giving him space, but his eyes never left the ground. Caleb planted the blade into the soil and pressed down with his boot, the earth giving way with a dull, damp sound. The first scoop was easy, loose dirt turning over without resistance, but the second felt different, thicker, packed, as though it had not been disturbed in a very long time. He worked slowly, not out of caution, but out of something deeper, a habit of control, of not rushing into what he did not understand. The rhythm began to settle in. Push, lift, toss. Each motion steady, each breath measured, the quiet scrape of metal against soil the only sound breaking the stillness. Atlas circled once, then lay down just a few feet away, his head resting on his paws, watching, waiting, as if he already knew what would come next. Minutes passed, then more, the hole growing wider, deeper, the scent of earth rising stronger with each turn of the shovel. Caleb paused, leaning on the handle, catching his breath, his eyes drifting over the small mound of displaced soil beside him. It should have felt like nothing more than digging, just another task, but it did not. There was a pull to it, something that kept him there even as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear. He drove the shovel down again, harder this time, and that was when it happened. A sharp, hollow sound echoed up through the metal, different from the dull resistance of dirt, clear enough to stop him mid-motion. Caleb froze, his grip tightening instinctively, his body going still in a way that came from old training, old instincts that never truly left. Atlas lifted his head immediately, ears forward, eyes alert, the same focused intensity returning in an instant. Caleb slowly pulled the shovel back and knelt down, brushing away loose soil with his hands. The dirt came away in clumps, revealing a flat surface beneath, dark, smooth, unmistakably man-made. He traced it with his fingers, feeling the edge, the shape, the way it did not belong to the natural lines of the land. It was not a rock. It was something placed there, something hidden. Caleb sat back slightly, his breath steady but deeper now, his mind already turning through possibilities he did not want to name. Atlas moved closer, standing beside him, his presence quiet but certain, as if to say this was only the beginning. Caleb looked down at the uncovered surface again, then around the clearing, as if expecting the trees themselves to explain what he had just found. The night had settled fully now, the air cooler, the silence thicker, wrapping around them like a held breath. He placed his hand flat against the surface once more, feeling its cold firmness beneath his palm, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Whatever lay beneath this ground had not been lost. It had been waiting, and somehow, for reasons he did not yet understand, it had been waiting for him. Caleb did not speak for a long moment, his hand still resting against the cold surface as if he were trying to feel its story through his palm alone. The night air settled deeper around them, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of something unseen moving through the trees. Atlas stood close now, his shoulder brushing lightly against Caleb's arm, grounding him in the present. Slowly, Caleb shifted forward and began clearing more dirt away with his hands, pushing soil aside with careful movements, revealing the edges of what lay buried. It was larger than he first thought, a flat metal plate, rectangular, its surface worn but intact, the corners squared with intention. Not something nature had shaped, something built, something placed. He brushed along one edge and found a seam, faint but unmistakable, running in a straight line beneath the dirt. A hatch. The word formed in his mind before he could stop it, bringing with it a quiet tension that settled into his chest. Atlas let out a soft exhale, almost like a sigh, then lowered his head and pressed his nose near the edge of the metal, tracing it slowly as if confirming what Caleb had just realized. "Someone put this here," Caleb said under his breath, his voice steady but quieter now, as though speaking too loudly might disturb whatever rested below. He leaned back slightly and looked around the clearing again, seeing it differently now, not as open land, but as a place chosen, measured, deliberate. The way the trees curved outward just enough, the way the ground dipped almost imperceptibly, the way the wind seemed to pass over instead of through. None of it felt accidental anymore. Caleb reached for the shovel and carefully widened the hole, working around the edges, exposing more of the hatch until its full shape came into view, roughly 3 feet by 5, set firmly into the earth as though it had been there for years, maybe decades. His movements slowed as he uncovered a small metal ring embedded near one side, half hidden beneath packed soil. He paused, staring at it, his breath deepening again, that old instinct rising quietly, not fear, but awareness, the kind that sharpened everything at once. Atlas sat beside him, perfectly still now, watching not the ground, but Caleb, as if the next step belonged to him alone. Caleb wiped his hands against his jeans, leaving dark streaks of earth behind, then reached toward the ring but stopped just short of touching it. For a moment, he simply hovered there, caught between what he knew and what he felt, between the safety of leaving it alone and the pull of uncovering what had been hidden. The silence pressed in, thick and patient, as if the world itself was waiting for him to decide. He glanced at Atlas, who held his gaze without blinking, calm, certain, unwavering. Caleb let out a slow breath and wrapped his fingers around the cold metal ring, feeling its solid weight in his grip. It did not move at first, held in place by time and earth, but when he pulled again, steady and controlled, there was a faint shift, a quiet sound, like something long asleep beginning to stir. Caleb froze for just a second, listening, not just with his ears, but with everything he had learned. To trust. And beneath the silence, there was something else now, not a sound exactly, but a presence, subtle and undeniable, waiting just beyond the thin barrier between what was buried and what was about to be found. The metal resisted at first, as if it had settled into the earth with no intention of ever being disturbed again, but Caleb did not rush it. He adjusted his grip on the ring and pulled with steady pressure, not force, letting the weight shift on its own terms. A low, dragging sound rose from beneath the soil, muted but unmistakable, like something long forgotten remembering how to move. The hatch lifted just enough to break the seal, and a thin breath of cold air slipped out from the darkness below, brushing against his hands and carrying with it a scent unlike the forest above, something older, dry, and still. Caleb stopped immediately, his body going quiet again, his senses sharpening in that familiar way, not from danger, but from awareness. Atlas stood the moment the hatch shifted, stepping closer, his ears forward, his eyes focused not on Caleb, but on the narrow opening that had just appeared. Caleb slowly pulled the hatch higher, inch by inch, until it opened enough to reveal a dark space beneath, the edges lined with metal framing that had held its shape through years of silence. He leaned forward slightly, careful, controlled, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness below. There were no sudden sounds, no movement, only stillness, the kind that felt preserved rather than empty. The faint outline of a ladder came into view, bolted securely into the side, descending into a small chamber hidden beneath the ground. Caleb exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooler air rising from below, and for a moment, he simply stared, not with fear, but with a quiet respect for whatever had been placed here. Atlas let out a soft, low sound, not warning, not alarm, something closer to acknowledgement, as if this place matched what he had sensed all along. Caleb shifted back and sat on the edge of the opening, his boots resting against the packed soil, his hands resting on his knees as he looked down again. "You knew," he said quietly, glancing at Atlas, who remained standing beside him, steady as ever. The dog's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, then stilled again. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, the metal casing worn but reliable, something he had carried for years without ever questioning why. He clicked it on and angled the beam downward, the light cutting through the darkness to reveal more of the chamber below. It was not large, perhaps 8 feet deep, the walls reinforced with aged panels, the floor level and clear, as though someone had once intended it to be used, not just hidden. There were shapes down there, not random, not scattered, but placed with purpose, though the details remained just out of reach from where he sat. Caleb felt that pull again, stronger now, not curiosity alone, but something deeper, something that asked more than it answered. He placed one hand on the ladder, testing its strength, feeling the cold metal steady beneath his grip. Atlas stepped closer, his nose brushing lightly against Caleb's arm, grounding him once more. Caleb nodded faintly, more to himself than to the dog, then shifted his weight forward. The world above seemed to quiet even further, as if the forest itself had stepped back, giving space to what was about to unfold. And as Caleb lowered one foot onto the first rung, he understood something without needing to say it out loud. This was not just a place hidden beneath the ground. This was a moment he had not been searching for, but one that had found him anyway. The ladder held firm beneath Caleb's weight as he descended slowly, one rung at a time, the metal cool against his palms, each step echoing faintly in the confined space below. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, revealing more detail with every inch he lowered himself. The walls lined with aged steel panels that bore faint marks of time, but no decay, as if the place had been sealed carefully against the years. The air was noticeably cooler, still and untouched, carrying a quiet that felt preserved rather than abandoned. When his boots finally reached the floor, the sound was soft, almost absorbed by the space itself, and he paused there, standing still, letting his eyes adjust while the light moved slowly across the room. It was not large, no more than 8 feet by 10, but everything inside it had been arranged with intention. Along one wall stood a narrow wooden table, its surface clean despite the time that must have passed, and on it rested a small collection of objects placed in careful order. A metal box, a stack of papers bound together with a faded cloth tie, and beside them, a glass jar filled with something that caught the light in a muted reflection. Caleb stepped forward, his movements measured, controlled, the same way he approached anything unknown, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he did not yet understand. Above him, he could hear Atlas shifting slightly at the opening, a quiet reassurance that he was not alone, even as he stood in a place untouched by the world above. Caleb reached the table and slowly ran the beam of light across its surface, the dust minimal, the edges sharp, the entire scene preserved as though someone had expected it to be found exactly like this. His hand hovered over the metal box for a moment before he touched it, feeling its weight, its solid presence beneath his fingers. It was not locked. That alone gave him pause. He glanced around the room again, noticing now the small details that had been hidden in shadow before, a folded chair against the far wall, a lantern mounted but long unlit, and on the opposite side, a simple wooden crate, closed but not sealed. Nothing felt chaotic. Nothing felt abandoned. It felt left, deliberately. Caleb let out a slow breath and turned his attention back to the table. He set the flashlight down carefully so its beam remained steady, illuminating the objects before him, and reached for the stack of papers. The cloth tie came loose easily, as if it had been wrapped to be opened again, not forgotten. As he lifted the top page, the faint sound of paper shifting echoed softly in the quiet chamber, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The forest above, the cabin, the years behind him, all of it stepped back as the words in his hands began to take shape under the beam of light. He had not yet read a single line, but something in the weight of it, in the way it had been kept, told him this was not just a collection of forgotten notes. This was a message. And as he stood there, in the stillness beneath the earth, Caleb realized with quiet certainty that whatever had brought him here had not been random, and whatever waited in those pages had been meant for someone who would listen, even if that someone had never known he was being called. Caleb lowered himself onto the edge of the wooden chair, the paper resting lightly in his hands, yet carrying a weight that had nothing to do with its thickness. The first line was written in careful, steady handwriting, the kind that belonged to someone who had taken their time, someone who knew these words might one day be read by eyes not their own. If you are reading this, it means you listened when others would have walked away. Caleb paused, his breath slowing as the sentence settled into him, not as a surprise, but as a quiet recognition. He glanced briefly toward the ladder above, where the faint outline of Atlas could be seen against the dim light filtering down, a silent reminder of how he had come here in the first place. Caleb looked back at the page and continued, his eyes moving steadily, his mind absorbing each word not just as information, but as something more personal, something directed. The writing spoke of time, of waiting, of a place chosen not by accident but by intention, a place meant to remain hidden until the right moment, until the right person arrived not by searching, but by listening. Caleb's fingers tightened slightly around the paper, his thumb brushing the edge unconsciously, as if grounding himself in something tangible while the meaning unfolded around him. The writer did not give a name at first, only thoughts, reflections, fragments of a life that had been lived quietly, deliberately, away from noise and distraction. There were mentions of building something beneath the surface, not for wealth, not for escape, but for preservation, for holding on to something that mattered beyond the passing of years. Caleb felt a subtle shift inside him as he read, a slow alignment between the words on the page and something he had carried without fully understanding. Atlas let out a soft sound above, barely more than a breath, and Caleb glanced up again, the connection between them steady and unspoken. He returned to the letter, turning the page carefully, the paper making a faint sound in the stillness. The next lines were more direct, more grounded, speaking not just to anyone, but to whoever had followed instinct over logic, patience over doubt. There are things the world forgets because it moves too fast, the writing continued. But forgetting does not mean they are gone. Caleb exhaled slowly, the words settling deeper now, not just heard, but felt. He looked around the small chamber again, at the objects placed with care, at the quiet order of it all, and began to understand that this was not a hidden place of fear or secrecy, but one of intention, of purpose waiting for its moment to return. His gaze moved back to the remaining pages, and though he had not yet reached the end, he knew already that whatever had been left here was not meant to remain buried forever. It had been left for someone willing to stop, to listen, to trust what could not be easily explained. And as Caleb sat there beneath the earth, the paper steady in his hands, he realized that Atlas had not just brought him to a place. He had brought him to a message that had been waiting longer than Caleb had even known he needed to hear. Caleb turned the next page slowly, the edges of the paper worn just enough to suggest it had been handled many times before it was finally placed here, as though the writer had revised these thoughts more than once, searching for the right way to say something that mattered. The words that followed were steadier, more grounded, no longer reflections but instructions, though they carried no urgency, only a quiet certainty. What you find here is not meant to be taken quickly, the letter read, and not everything of value can be measured by what it is worth. Caleb's eyes moved across the lines, his breathing even, his posture still, absorbing each sentence as if it were unfolding directly within him rather than on the page. He reached for the metal box on the table, his fingers resting on its lid for a moment before opening it carefully. Inside, the beam of his flashlight revealed neatly arranged items, a small stack of documents bound in protective sleeves, a set of old keys, and beneath them, a folded envelope thicker than the rest. Caleb lifted the envelope first, feeling its weight, its presence more deliberate than the others, and set it aside for a moment, choosing instead to examine the documents below. He slid one free and held it under the light, recognizing official markings, property records, dates that stretched back decades, and signatures written in the same careful hand as the letter. This was not random. This was structured, preserved, intentional. His gaze shifted back to the letter, and he continued reading, the words now more direct, almost as if the writer anticipated this exact moment. There are things placed here for you to use, but only if you understand why they were kept. Caleb exhaled slowly, his eyes lifting from the page to the room around him, the table, the crate, the quiet order of everything. And for the first time, he saw it not just as a hidden space, but as something prepared, something waiting not to be discovered, but to be continued. Above him, Atlas shifted again, a soft scrape of movement echoing down through the opening, and Caleb glanced up briefly, the connection between them unchanged, steady as ever. He returned to the envelope in his hands and opened it carefully, sliding out a single sheet folded in thirds. The paper inside was newer than the others, the ink darker, the lines more recent, and at the top, a name was written clearly for the first time. Caleb read it once, then again, letting it settle, not because he recognized it, but because something about it felt familiar in a way he could not explain. Below the name were instructions, simple, direct, guiding him to the crate on the far side of the room. Caleb stood slowly, the letter still in his hand, and walked across the chamber, each step measured, each movement deliberate. He knelt beside the crate and placed the flashlight on the ground beside him, the beam illuminating its surface. The wood aged but solid, the lid secured with a simple latch. He paused there, just for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the top, feeling the grain beneath his fingers, the quiet stillness of something that had not been opened in years. Then, without hesitation, he lifted the latch. The sound was soft, almost gentle, and as the lid rose, the light revealed what had been kept inside, not scattered, not forgotten, but arranged with care, as though someone had known exactly how it would be found, and exactly who would be the one to find it. Inside the crate, the contents were arranged with a care that felt almost reverent, each item placed not for storage, but for meaning. Caleb leaned closer, the beam of the flashlight steady as it revealed a folded canvas bag, a small wooden box, and beneath them, a stack of bound documents thicker than those on the table. He reached first for the wooden box, lifting it slowly, feeling its solid weight, the smoothness of its surface worn by time, but preserved with intention. When he opened it, the hinges moved without resistance, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside, nestled carefully, were a set of old photographs, edges softened with age, each image capturing moments that felt distant yet deeply human. Caleb picked one up, holding it under the light, his eyes tracing the faces, a man standing beside a younger version of this very land, the trees smaller, the clearing more open, a cabin in the background not unlike the one he now called home. There was no date written, but the story was there in the details, in the posture, in the quiet pride of someone who had built something meant to last. Caleb set the photograph down gently and reached for the canvas bag next, unfolding it to reveal tools, not new, but well-maintained, each one carefully wrapped, each one carrying the mark of use without neglect. These were not things left behind. These were things passed forward. His gaze shifted to the stack of documents at the bottom, and as he lifted them, he understood their weight before even opening them. Property lines, ownership records, handwritten notes outlining boundaries and resources, all tied to this land, all connected to the name he had read moments earlier. It was not just a message. It was a transfer, quiet and deliberate, not announced, not claimed, but entrusted. Caleb let out a slow breath, the realization settling over him not as shock, but as something steadier, something that felt earned in a way he could not fully explain. Above, Atlas gave a soft, single bark, not urgent, not questioning, but acknowledging, as if the moment itself had reached its natural point. Caleb gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the crate with the same care they had been given, then rose slowly to his feet. He took one last look around the chamber, at the table, the letter, the quiet order of it all, and understood that nothing here had been hidden out of fear. It had been protected, preserved, waiting for someone who would see it not as a discovery, but as a responsibility. He climbed the ladder with steady movements, the light from above growing stronger with each step, the air warming as he emerged back into the open night. Atlas stepped forward immediately, his presence close, grounding, familiar. Caleb closed the hatch carefully behind him, covering it just enough to protect it, not to hide it completely. He stood there for a moment, looking out across the clearing, the same place that had felt ordinary just hours before, now holding a quiet weight that changed everything. Atlas moved beside him, calm, steady, as if nothing had changed at all. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head, his gaze still fixed on the land before him. He had not come here searching for anything. He had not asked for a sign, or a purpose, or a second chance. But somehow, through a quiet persistence he had almost ignored, something had found him anyway. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the soft scent of earth and pine, Caleb understood that some paths are not chosen in the way people expect. Sometimes, they are revealed one step at a time, guided not by certainty, but by trust, until the place you stand no longer feels like where you ended up, but exactly where you were meant to be.